Okay. All right. I think we're going to get started here. Welcome to the GameMaker webinar on audio. My name's Aaron Craig. I am super excited to be doing this. If you've got any questions as we go, just let me know and I'll answer them as we go. We've got Mr. Sam Wayne in the chat. He can also be answering questions as we're going through this, but I want to show you what we're going to be working on. So if you're interested, we've got this project that I'm going to be showing you, walking through, and kind of talking about in this webinar, available on GitHub. It is not a private one, so I'll go ahead and throw this link in the chat, actually, if you're interested in finding it. But this is going to cover basically everything you need to know about audio in GameMaker. We're going to go through audio effects, audio emitters, 3D audio, 2D audio, stopping, starting, pausing, all of that. And this project also covers it. So I hope you guys find that useful. So the question I asked before we started was, when do you think about audio? Because for me, I know that I always think about audio last when it comes to GameMaker or just gaming in general. Like, I know it's important, and once I actually add it in, it's a huge change. Like, I can actually feel my game, and it's a lot more fun. It's just, I am very mechanically minded, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but when it comes to audio, it definitely helps to have it in your game and to be thinking about it in the beginning, because there's actually a tremendous amount you can do with it. So let's go ahead and take a look at this project together, and let me know if you've got any issues. I should have my audio up and running so you can also hear this. So the first thing we're going to look at is this audio project. And this project has quite a few different things in it. When you run it for the first time, the first page is actually going to be a very simple music player that you can see right here. So we've got volume controls on the left, and here is our current cue, and we can press play. I'm going to go and turn the volume down to smidgen and press play. So all of the sounds and audio and music that's coming from here is actually from the asset bundles on GameMaker. So if you like them, check them out on there. They're actually really good. I like them quite a bit. So this is pretty simple. This just allows us to play songs. We can actually move back, forward. We can fast forward if we want to. We can control the volume. We can mute it completely. All of this is pretty basic audio. Like, when you actually go into the GameMaker manual, they have it as like the default basic audio functions, and then they have advanced audio functions, and none of these take advantage of the advanced audio functions, which is okay. You don't always need advanced audio functions inside of your game. I'm being told I can't hear the music, so let me verify that I've got music up and running. Music from GameMaker. So give me 1 second. I want to make, like, it would be good for everyone to be able to hear this. So let me make sure we've got this coming through. Yeah, hopefully it makes sense. Looks like the settings are right on my end. Let me just verify that I've got things coming out the way that they are supposed to be coming out. Track 1, and let's try that. Hopefully you guys can hear that now. It should be coming through. So this right here, pretty simple. Like, the fast forward function, it's kind of cool. So let me break down how this works. In the project, it's all broken down inside of these groups. The audio player is basically the first level. If you look at rooms, you're going to have them kind of match up with these groups and the objects that are here. And so the audio player is here, and here's all the objects that correspond to that. The main one is the music manager. So when you play a sound, the first function that you need to know is this one right here. This audio play sound. This is the de facto thing that you use when you want to play audio inside of your game. You give it the sound you want to play, the priority, and whether it loops. And now there's actually a lot of optional functions like gain, offset, pitch, and listener mask, Most of those aren't important. The main one that's really useful is gain, which is the volume that you're hearing it at. You can adjust all audio inside of here, and you can adjust the volume that it plays at, but sometimes you want to adjust it based on when it's playing. And so being able to adjust it when you actually call it is great. So what I do is I play this sound, I save it in a global variable here, and I start it at 0 volume because I want it to start so that it's beginning, and then I pause it immediately. And that's kind of what happens, is this alarm pauses it, and then I can resume it. So the first thing you gotta know about audio in GameMaker is how to actually play it. This sound, audio play sound, does that. Now to do the cue that I've set up here, I've used the function audio get name, which actually returns the name of it. And the rest of that is really not super important. All I'm doing is I'm getting the name, I'm doing a little bit of replacing like the underscores and the sound, like the actual name of the file itself, sound aquatic theme right here. I just remove sound, remove the underscores, and I lowercase it. That's not anything related to do with sound, but if you did want to actually display sound files on here, you totally can do that with some string manipulation and this function audio get name. But we play a sound, and then if we want to, let's say in this theme, we want to skip it or go back, what we actually want to do is we want to stop a sound. So if you want to play something, it's audio play sound. If you want to stop something, it's audio stop sound. And for a music player, you would stop what's currently playing and then move on to the next one, which is what this function skip song does. It checks to make sure that we're not outside of the playlist. That way we don't try to play something that doesn't exist. And we stop the sound that's playing, we increase which one we're on, and we play a new sound. And that's really all that's doing. Same thing for the previous song, we just go back one. So that part is pretty simple. The thing that happens that you do need to know about and is a little unintuitive is to move on to another song. If you've got a queue of songs, is you use this function audio is playing, because this is actually going to tell you if something is playing, and as soon as it stops playing, this is going to return false. So this little chunk of code in the step event just says, hey, is the music that I did originally set on this global variable still active? And if it's not, we're going to move on to the next one. That's kind of what's going on there. And then pausing the music allows me to set the gain, and I can pause a sound. So there's two functions here that we haven't talked about yet. We can play music, we can stop music, we can also pause. I have a lot of fingers going on. We can also pause music here. So the difference between stopping music and pausing music is if you pause it, you can then later resume it at any given time. So if you're keeping track of what you're playing and you want it to continue later on at that same spot, you can just pause the sound and then you can resume it later. Audio sound gain allows you to set the volume of a sound. There's a ton of functions like this where you can control where it's at, how loud it is, what's going on. And these are all still kind of the basic audio functions. The way this one works is you tell it which one you want to pause, and then you give it the level you want to be at. And a lot of these values are what we call normalized, which means that they are from 0 to 1. And what it actually means is it's from 0% to 100% volume. That's what normalized is. So in this case, 1 means it's actually at full volume. And then you can give it a time. So that's how fast. So if you want to be able to fade music in and out of GameMaker, what you're going to do is you're going to set this time to something like 5,000 because this is in milliseconds. Again, something that you have to read the manual for. It says right there, time, the length for the change in gain in milliseconds. Sometimes it's milliseconds, sometimes it's seconds, so you always want to make sure, because if you put 5,000 seconds in there, that's not going to do anything. So milliseconds allows us to change this from whatever the sound is, which if you can recall, we actually started at 0 volume. And then this alarm is going to change it. Now, I set it to instantly change. It's still paused because we actually pause it right there. That's why, like, the whole effect that we're going for here is we start it, but you don't actually hear the sound at all. It's paused and ready to resume, but it doesn't start when the project starts. And that's why it starts at 0 volume and then it goes up to 1 volume. But fading music in and out is actually as simple as calling this audio sound gain, giving it a volume, giving it something like 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. And then it will change either from playing loud or soft to loud, whatever you want to do there. That's how that works. So fading music is actually not that hard to do. The timing that you need is a little trickier. You definitely want to have a full-on music manager object, because I have tried to do even simple audio where you have a theme song for one level versus another, and just playing it, like, you have to know when it's at 0 and you have to have alarms and you've got to check if something is playing. So having a music manager is important. Doing it, it's not that hard. There's a few functions you got to know about. And that is the basic audio function. So like, if you had no idea how to play any audio in GameMaker, you're good to go. You can now play, you can set the volume, you can stop, you can check if something's playing, you can set the volume yourself while it's playing over time, and you can pause it. And if you really care, you can even draw the name of the song on the screen. So all of that is kind of the basic of the audio functions inside of GameMaker. So before I move on to the next section, which is super exciting, which is the effects in GameMaker, anybody got any questions on here? I'm looking at the YouTube chat, so if you've got anything, throw a question out there. Mr. Sam Wayne will probably answer it for you, but if not, I can also answer it. And if nothing needs to be asked, then we will just move on. So here's that first page. Now move on to the next one. We click on the effects slider. Now, the effects in GameMaker are a relatively new addition. So if you're using LTS, they're not going to be available. If you haven't updated in a couple of months, they're not going to be available. Definitely make sure you update, because this is awesome. This is a game changer when it comes to audio. This little project, I think, is really cool at visualizing and being able to play around with all of the different audio effects. So they're going to continue adding more, but as of right now, we've got reverb, bit crusher, delay, gain, high pass filter, and a low pass filter. Now, if you're an audio person, you probably already know what most of these do, but I went into this actually not knowing too much about every single one, and probably the one that surprised me the most is delay. I don't know if it's industry standard for how it works, but it's pretty cool. So let's take a look at each one of these. Over here on the left, I have sounds that you can play. Alien death, coin pickup, door close, explosion, shotgun blast. So you can experiment with these. And the first thing you've got to know is that when you're using audio effects, you can have them be bypassed. And what that means is, if bypass is enabled, that means that you're not actually going to hear anything at all. You can see that these have different properties. Like these are the names that they have inside of the manual. I tried to make it as close to that as possible. So that means that for reverb, there's a dampening, a size, and a mix. If you jump over to delay, there's a time, a feedback, and a mix. So you'll notice that mix is on pretty much all of these, except for these last 3 here. And each one has its own special properties, but all of them have the bypass option. So you can have an effect ready to go, and as soon as you are not bypassing it anymore, it activates. So let's listen to each one of these with some audio effects. So first, let's do coin pickup. That's what it sounds like. Let's put it on the reverb. It is basically a tunnel. It's a huge, it's an echo chamber. It sounds pretty cool. And it keeps playing, and it really changes. And we're going to get to these sliders to play with them, and I'll show you the code behind all of this as we go, but I just want to show you what these effects do. So, Bit Crusher takes the sound and it kind of distorts it to a kind of a lower bit rate. So if you do something that's already pretty like low, like full of low, you know, like deeper sounds, you're not going to hear much at all. Like that door close, it's already kind of a deeper sound. And so when we bit crush it, there's really nothing there. But if we do coin pickup, you can see that it still kind of sounds like it, but it's making it more, well, it's crushing those bits, and it's making it a lot less high quality sound. Like it's only keeping a few of them. This is really cool for creating sound effects like on the fly. If you've got some sound effects, but you want them to sound like an older era with less audio inside of it, you can use this bit crusher and you can make it so that it sounds older, which is pretty cool. Delay here, I've got to adjust this because the time is set to default of 10 seconds. This is in seconds, so I'm going to set this to just like 0.6. What delay is going to do is it is going to play the sound again at the certain time with how much you set it. So this one is a little confusing in name because reverb and delay, like reverb is like you're in an echo chamber. Delay means it's going to play again and again and again. So if we did in a laser gun, and I'll bypass that. So it just plays again and again and again, which is pretty cool. But if you don't change the feedback on this specifically, it will continue playing forever until you stop it. So that's something to keep in mind on the delay. The gain is purely volume. So if you've maxed out the sounds you're trying to play and you want it to be even louder, you can come over here. I'm not going to do a gain of 10 because that would be very loud, but we'll go ahead and I'll play the coin pickup, and then I will multiply it by 2.76, and it's a lot louder. So you can get these really, really loud, and the cool thing about these effects is you can apply them to any emitter. You can apply them to the main emitter. You can stack effects, so we can actually have all of these active at once if we want to, or just a select few. Again, we're going to dive into the code here pretty soon. So last two are high pass and low pass filters. These essentially, you choose a frequency and it's going to eradicate that frequency from the audio. Now, this one's a little bit tricky in terms of like, if you're not familiar with audio, if you're not an audio person, it's going to take a while to figure this out, but let's see if we can find something. So high pass filter means that we should be cutting off, well, we're either cutting off the high stuff or we're only keeping the high stuff. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but we've got coin pickup is a high one, so we'll do that. And so that's cutting off the frequency at that. And we can continue changing this, and it looks like the high pass filter is just keeping those high ones, which is kind of cool. We can then do the low pass filter, and if we bring this over here, it's only keeping the low sounds of that. So these audio effects drastically change how your audio actually plays. So let's take a look at how we would use them. In this project, we're going to go to the objects and we're going to do effects. So these, each one of these is that in that room. So let me show you the room itself for how we've got it laid out. So here's the room in GameMaker. These are all taken care of drawing the audio and the sounds and the stuff themselves. But each one of these is the object that we're playing with. So if we take a look at the bit crusher effect, here's what we've got. I create some variables here and I give it some names. So let's go ahead and open up the manual for the audio effects, because this is going to be pretty helpful. And let's go to the audio effect type, and we want these right here. So, and it looks like we have a new audio effect type as well. So we've got all of these right here, And the way we work with them is each one of them has their own struct that you're going to interact with. You're going to either set the data, or you're going to set the data with the struct, and then you're going to apply that effect. So if we go in and we can take a closer look at this, and this page, the audio effect struct, is actually going to tell you every single property that is inside of this struct, what it does, and how you're going to use it. Almost all these properties are normalized. So when we take a look at the reverb, you're giving it a range from 0 to 1 for dampening. That means that anything outside of those are not going to work properly. So make sure that you remember that these are mostly normalized. So each of these effects have a struct, tells you the type, tells you the description, tells you the variable name. So when you're working with these, if you don't know what they do or how they work, come in here and check out the manual. The main function that we want is going to be audio effect create. What this does, it actually has some examples right here, is we create that audio effect, we save it in a variable, and then we set each of the properties of the specific effect that we're using. So in my code here, what we've got is I created these properties here because each one of these properties is actually a slider that you can affect, which is why I need it to be a variable. And I have this function called apply effect. And when we click on, actually, this is just always being set whenever we change that slider. That's kind of how it works. How this project is set up is not something I want to dive into because you can go look at it, and I really want to focus on the audio effects. So if you're curious how it works, download the project, go through each of the objects, and you'll figure it out. But we use the function audio create effect, and we use the real audio effect type, and then we tell it what kind it is. And we save that into a variable, and then we can access each of those properties. So the bit crusher effect has a bypass. They all have a bypass. This one then has a drive, a factor, a resolution, a mix, and when you've set all of those to what you want, you then put it on an audio bus. Now, for this project, I'm using audio bus main. And I really don't get into creating buses in this project. There's just a little too much happening. But the thing you gotta know is audio bus main is where every single thing that is played inside of GameMaker passes through. Any sound effect, any music, anything at all goes through this. And so by setting anything on this, it changes all audio. And specifically, this bus has an array of effects that we can come in here and we can set. So I'm setting that effect we created with the properties we set to this array. And that means that GameMaker is now going to have all audio that's played through it having this effect on it. If it's bypassed, nothing happens. If it isn't bypassed, then it does actually take into effect. And that's how all of these work. Is we have this create event here, which sets them by the default, and then you can adjust them with the sliders, and we just set each of these properties. So there are multiple buses, and you can create them, and that actually opens it up to, you can create a bus, and you can have that specific bus play some music or some sound effects, and you can have specific effects on that bus only, and not affect all audio. So that's kind of how that works. So if you want to look into that, use audio bus create, and then you're going to be playing audio effects on that bus. Pretty cool. GameMaker has a tremendous amount of fine-grained control when it comes to playing audio. And you can stack these. So let's go back into the project, and let's take a look at what it would look like with some of these connected. So I'll turn reverb on, and I'll bring it down just a little bit. So let's play a coin pickup. So you can hear it, it's playing, pretty cool. Now let's try Bit Crusher. And we'll bring this down a little bit because I don't actually want to completely destroy this. Oof, that is so bad. Let's bring the Bit Crush down a little more. Nope, let's do door close. This bit crusher is just so strong. Let's go ahead and bring in that high pass filter again and play coin pickup. Whew. If you can hear that, that's kind of cool. So we played the coin, and with this slider specifically, you can adjust how that effect is being played. And it's live, and it's constantly changing, which means that that sound is playing, and we've got this cutoff frequency there, and it creates kind of a cool effect. But the point of this is you can have as many audio effects as you want. And being able to create your own buses and stack audio effects means that there's no limit to what you can create. So if you've got any music, any audio effect, and you want to be able to do something more interesting, this is really going to change what you can do inside of GameMaker. You don't have to now know how to edit audio and use those softwares to be able to go in and put these effects in there. You can do them live, dynamically, and you can do them inside of your game. Well, I guess that's what dynamic means. But this, I think, really changes what you can do with GameMaker. It really steps up the game. So hopefully you've got some pretty cool ideas for how this all works. So let's go and move on to the next section. Actually, let me see if we've got any more questions here. I see that we had, I think... All right, does anybody have any questions that you've got so far? I'm happy to answer them, and these audio effects are pretty cool. There's tons of documentation. When you start working with them, it can be a little confusing because of how you've got to create it, and if you're not used to structs yet, then it will take a little bit of time, but it's really cool. So, and the drawing in here is just drawing the text and setting things so that you can read them and see what's going on. Otherwise, you create the audio effect, set the struct, and then set it to whatever bus you want and whichever part of the array you're looking for. So, I don't see any questions yet. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. The next part of the game, or the project I've got here, we've got just an actual example of these audio effects in place. So let's say you had a game where you had a cave going and you had something where you wanted reverb to go in there. This, I think, is a pretty practical project. If you move around, we've got these little red lines, and these are going to indicate when I trigger an audio effect, and specifically the reverb effect. So I'm going to hit this, and now it sounds like I'm in a much open, wider cave. If I go back, you can hear, I hope, kind of how this is just regular audio. This is just playing it with audio play sound. And as soon as I go through this, it is now sounding a lot more interesting. And then finally, this one sets the full reverb effect there. So if you had a game where you wanted reverb to be in effect, this is a pretty interesting way to do it. Before we move on to this section, Ahmed asked a question, where can I find this sound effects? So if you're looking for the project itself, I put a link to the GitHub project and you can download it and actually play around with this specifically. If you want to know how to use the audio effects, you're going to open up the manual, and under the audio, let's see, where's it at? So under audio, we now have audio effects. So you can either search directly for audio effects or just keep poking around the manual until you find audio effects themselves. And from there, you have everything that you're going to need. So audio effects is under advanced audio right there. The audio, if you're looking for the specific audio effects that I am using inside of this project, they are all, let me see if I can, they are all coming from the GameMaker bundles. So all of the sounds and audio effects are from here. If you do not have a subscription to GameMaker, then you can only download the most recent one. But if you do have any subscription, you have access to all of these. So I got these from, I think, Music Tracks 2, and then there were some audio effects inside of here as well. So you can check those out. They're all pretty cool. They're also very high quality. I love the the music tracks, especially, they have a theme, and then they have a win and a loss sting at the end. And so it's a really great transition. If you're in a room and you win or lose, you just play that and fade out the other one. So it's actually really high quality stuff. Definitely check it out if you're interested. Any other questions that I missed on there? Let me bring this up. I don't have an answer for when GameMaker will Turkish language support is going to come. That is not my area of expertise. Okay, let's go ahead and jump back to this project. And this is the emitters. So, GameMaker can play 2D audio, which is everything we've been doing up until this point, where the audio comes out of your headphones equally on both sides, and it's the same. That is probably what you're most familiar with. But GameMaker can also do 3D audio. 3D. Okay. You can do 3D audio. And what that means is the audio actually is inside of the game world somewhere. So in this project that we're looking at, this head indicates where the player would be located. And each one of these, and the red one is a moving one, which we'll talk about, each one of these speakers is an audio that is playing in that world in a 3D sense. Which means that when I grab my person and I move them, we can actually hear the audio get louder. And if I move to one side, we can actually hear it over here as opposed to over here. Same thing on all of these. Some of them are a little bit easier to tell. And if you move all the way away, you can't hear anything. This 3D audio is extremely powerful and very versatile. And of course, you can combine everything we've been talking about with audio effects inside of here, which is really cool. But this is really, like, when you discover 3D audio and how to work with it, at least for me, it really changed what I thought I could do. Because this is really when you start making your game more immersive. Having music and sound effects in general, awesome. Your game goes from here, all the way up to here. When you start adding in 3D audio, man, it is just so cool. And I know 3D audio sounds strange to say in a 2D game engine, but it just means that the audio is not always going to be heard equally wherever the player is. So, we've got things like this where we can hear it in one ear versus the other. We also have moving audio, which actually has a fall-off model. So that means that as it gets closer, we can hear it, and then it moves away in a very natural sense. So, what is all of that? Let's go ahead and open up the emitters group here. And this is where we've got to set some things up. So, when you want to use 3D audio, the main thing you're going to use is this function. Let's see. Audio play sound on. This is different than audio play sound. You actually have to tell it which emitter it's going to, what sound, the loop, priority. Those things kind of remain the same. And you have those optional parameters as well. But the difference is where are you actually going to play it? And what you're playing it on is called an emitter, something that creates something. And in this case, we first had to create an emitter, save it, set the position of the emitter. So we're putting something in our game world. Let's go ahead and open up that room for emitters. We are putting something inside of the game world at an actual location. And we're saying audio is going to come from that. And that audio is actually going to play from this position, and if the player is close enough, they'll be able to hear it. A totally different experience than just always having audio available. So, in this case, we're setting it to the emitter we just made. We're setting the position of the emitter we just made to where it's at. And then the last one is Z. So, all of these are 3D audio is what it says, which means that it has an X, a Y, and a Z. So if you had some kind of 2.5D depth inside of your game, or you wanted to actually make your game 3D in GameMaker, you could use this Z property to do that. Otherwise, it's really just going to be 0. And that's because we don't have a Z when it comes to two-dimensional games. So most of the time, you're going to want this to just be 0 when you're talking about the Z property of the emitters. Then we have to set a fall off. And this is where it requires a little bit of explanation. So the idea behind an emitter is pretty simple. And in that you pick a spot, you say, hey, play a sound at this location. This is exactly like real world. And if you think about it in real world terms, that's what I'm going to get to when we talk about the fall off. If you think about an audio being played in, let's say, the room next to you, you don't hear it as loud as the person in that room. And how that audio falls off, because it gets quieter as things go, how GameMaker is actually going to treat that audio is determined by what we call the fall off model. And you use a function called audio emitter fall off. You set the emitter that you want, you give it a fall off distance and a fall off max distance and a fall off factor. So let's go ahead and open up the manual and take a look at some of this, because this, to me, is probably the most confusing part of 3D audio. But the beautiful thing is that once you get it right, you can just use those settings everywhere. And you don't have to continue setting the model. You basically just set it once for an emitter, and then it plays like that forever, unless you want to change it. So there's a lot of text here, a lot of explanation, and it all relies on setting the fall off model, because the model we're actually going to use is going to be one of these constants right here. And GameMaker is kind of cool. It actually shows you how it's going to determine that with math, but then I don't care about the math. I care about these images here. So when we talk about fall off, it means that how much can I hear from where I am as opposed to where the music is actually coming from, or the sound effect. And we have 3 main models to look at: the inverse distance, the linear distance, and the exponential distance. These are 3 different models for how your audio can work inside of GameMaker. And we're going to get back to the emitter fall off in just a little bit, but this is a really important tangent. So you're going to choose one of these, or I guess you could actually choose audio fall off none, but in that case the gain is 1 for always, which means you might as well just be playing it with 2D audio. It's possible though. So we want to choose one of these 3 models, and it's going to either fall off in one of these curves. Now these curves you might recognize from math class. You don't need to know how they work, but if you want to know how they work, they actually talk about it right here. But essentially this says, how much noise can my player hear from where the audio is coming from? So do you want it to be an inverse distance where it's kind of a slope, it's kind of a regular curve here, or it can be a linear thing, which is going to be a little strange, but you could do it. Or do you want it to be exponential, which means that it's going to fall off really, really hard. And what model you choose might depend on the kind of game, atmosphere, and world that you're building. Because a linear distance model would make a lot more sense if you're out in the open field. But if you're in a cave system, or you're in something where there's a ton of natural barriers that might soak up sound, the exponential model might make a lot more sense. And you've got things for clamping it and scaling it. And I don't want to jump into too much of that, but essentially you're going to choose one of these 3 models, and you can change how each of those models work. And from that, well, let's go to the listener. Everything we just talked about is this right here, the audio fall off set model function. I chose audio fall off exponent distance scaled. That means that it's going to fall off in I think a very natural, organic way, and it cannot go more than what it's set to here with scaled. That's kind of what it's doing. So we set those, and we'll get to this function in a minute, but we set that model, Then the fall off uses that model, and we just tell it how many pixels away is that model going to go into effect. So we have the distance when it starts happening. So if we are 100 pixels or less close to it, this audio is going to just be playing like we can hear it at full volume. Then from 100 to 400, it's going to start falling off with this fall off factor of 1.2 and the fall off model. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand exactly how the math works there, but essentially this number says, hey, between these two numbers, we're going to start falling off at this percent or this strength. And the stronger the number, I believe it's going to fall off harder. So you can choose the curve or the line, if you chose linear, and then you can choose kind of how strong that falls off between these two distances, which means that in this project, you can play around with these values for each one, for each of these emitters that we have. So if I come in here and we can choose the sound with the creation code, and then the emitter itself, we can actually, if you wanted to, you could change these and you can see how they sound and how they work. And then we play the sound on it. The last thing you've got to know is this one right here. And this is the audio listener set orientation function. Basically, you have to tell GameMaker how do you want the listening experience of the player to be set up. So this means, like, do you want the audio on the left to be on the left because the person's facing the front? Are they facing towards the actual screen, like looking at the player? In that case, left would actually be over here, and you can control all of that. I always find this image extremely funny just because, like, this is a very realistic render of a man's head and it's just hanging out upside down and stuff, but it does a good job at showing, hey, this audio emitter is over here. How do you actually want the ears? How do you want this sound to be sent to the player, and how do you want them to hear it? This, you just have to set one time. You set the X, the look at XYZ, and the up XYZ. In my case, I played around and I found this combination to be looking like you're in the game world, and it makes the most sense for hearing on the headphones that the player is using. So the lookout X is 1, the lookout Y is 1, and finally the up Z is 1. Everything else is 0. And if you change these, it's going to change what is left and what is right as you are listening to audio, but you can play around with it until you find the one that works for what you want to do, or you can change it up as you go. So all of that explanation, let's go back and take a look at that again. So here are our emitters. Here is our player. We have oriented it so that when I go here, on the left is where this is coming from for me. Then I go on the right, and now I'm on the right. And if you go right in the middle, it plays on both equally. And as I move away from this, it gets quieter and quieter until at 400, I can no longer hear it at all. That's what those numbers are, is the distance away. So between under 100, it's going to play at full volume. Between 100 and 400, it's going to fall off harder and harder the further you get away. The only one we didn't talk about was this OBJ moving emitter. And this is actually pretty simple too. It uses almost all the exact same things here. So if you get the emitters, you'll get this. The only thing you need to really change is this function, audio emitter velocity. Velocity is how fast you're moving and where you're going. And all you got to do is set that, hey, I'm moving at a certain speed, and then it's going to play the sound from where it's at. And that's really all about it. In this case, we set the speed for H speed, and then we tell it that's how fast we're moving. And then we continually update the emitter position as well right here. So we need to continually update it with that, but we also set how fast we're moving, because audio, when it moves, it does change how you hear it. So if I change this to 30, it's going to sound quite a bit different because of how fast it's going. You don't get that full brunt of the volume anymore because the audio is flying past the player here. And that's just kind of how it works. So you can, I don't want to leave that playing. You can adjust those settings and play around with this project. It's really cool. I hope you guys enjoy the project. I spent a while on it. I'm pretty proud of it. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about is loop points. Before we do that, let's take a look at the questions. We've got Starfish asking, what can you have 3D audio in a 2D game? I'm not quite sure what you can have means, but you can. So I'll answer this in two different ways, and if I didn't answer it the way you intended, give it a little more clarification. You can have everything we've been talking about right now is 3D audio in the sense of the position inside of the world. So the player hears it when they get close. The most common example is like a waterfall or some lava. You can hear it in the distance, and then as you get closer, you can actually hear it louder. But the other thing you can do with 3D audio that we have not talked about is if you've got something in your game, by default in the sound setting, the output is set to mono. And what that means is it's the same sound going to be coming out of left ear and right ear. That does not mean that it's actually only coming out of one ear, which is a common misconception. Mono means it has the same audio for both. But if you go to stereo, this means that you essentially have something in your left ear that is not the exact same as your right ear. This is a pretty uncommon thing, but it is something that some musics do because you might want to have sounds coming left and right, like in the actual music flow itself. And you can change the output here to stereo. There is also a 3D output, and if you're going to be using your sounds as 3D, it is recommended to put this as 3D. But in general, most of the time your output is going to be mono because it's going to actually have the same sound stream on the left versus the right. This webinar is technically mono in that sense. If I had two mics and I moved closer to one versus the other, then you'd want it to be stereo because you'd want it to be updated versus which one I'm talking into. But most of the time your audio and music is going to be mono. Sharknado, I love that's a great name. Sharknado asks, how do things sound if you do use the Z-axis? That's a really great question. It is not something I actually experimented with because I don't use the Z-axis in my game. But why don't we go ahead and jump over to that? Because with this project, you can go in and change it. So let's go to an audio emitter, and we've got a Z-axis. Let's start with a value of 100 and see what happens. So let's go over to the emitters. And I kind of doubt I'm going to hear much of a difference. I don't hear anything. Let's try 1,000. And see what it says, or see what it does. So setting that Z means that I can't actually hear it at all because it thinks that I'm more than 400 away. So if I set this to something like 350, I think it's going to think that I'm that far away from it, and it's going to be very, very quiet. So the Z property that we're setting here is something that you'd have to use and update the actual player somehow here as well. So the listener would need to actually update. So something I didn't cover, sorry about that, is to set the model, we set the orientation, and the step event actually sets our position. So if you've got 2.5D games where maybe you've got some audio way, way up high, and you want to have that audio only be available when the player starts jumping and climbing, you can do that by setting the audio positioner right here with the Z-axis of the audio emitter position. If your game does not use the z-axis in any sort of way, like in an isometric game or 2.5D, this z-axis is not going to be what you want, because if you've got something like fire jump or an infinite platformer where you're jumping up and down, that you're still going to want to use the X and Y, but in that case, the Y would essentially be your up and down. If you're going to bring in that z-axis, you've got to think about it, because it does make it more confusing. But that's how it would work. The audio emitter position is directly tied to the audio listener position. And you've got to keep those things in sync. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to change that. This whole thing, what's happening is I click on it and it follows me. It changes my X and Y. And this function is always updating the listener position to X and Y. That's how the emitter room actually works in general. So GPTX6 says it's only good for 3D games. I'd say not, that's what it's more for, but it's also not. One of my favorite games was Crosscode that came out. Not a GameMaker game, but it is a 2.5D game where you actually have to jump on platforms, and there is a Z because you can run into them, or you can go around and actually get up on them, and then you can fall down. That kind of game could use audio that's higher up here that the player couldn't hear down here, but as they climbed platforms, they could hear it. So you can absolutely use the Z-axis in GameMaker in a 2D game. It is just going to be a little more uncommon, and most of the time you're going to be using X and Y, with Y being your Z or your up and down inside of the game. Something to keep in mind, and something that I just learned. So, pretty cool. Last thing. We're actually getting right to the end, and this is right about the same. This is perfect timing. So, we've got loop points now available inside of GameMaker. Really, really cool stuff. No longer do you have to go in and actually manually loop it or use some code to check to see the position of it and then restart it. What loop points are is you set them once, and then if they're active, when the song gets there, or the audio effect or whatever, gets to that loop point, it restarts back to that point where you set. So if I click on this, I'll actually turn the loop off, and now it's going to play through it. And if I turn it back on, it doesn't happen because I haven't hit that point. You have to actually hit it, not just be beyond it. So that's one area there, and then here's one that doesn't have any loops in it, and so setting it active or not active does nothing. But if we come back to this one, it can start at the beginning, and then it can loop from 5 to 2.5. And the code for something like this is going to be in the loop point object, and I can't remember where I put it. It's not there. It's going to be in the loop. Here we go. So this loop object saves the sound we're playing, and then we play it. So you just play the sound as normal. And then the two functions you're looking for are audio sound loop start and audio sound loop end. These two functions are what does all of the looping, and for the most part, it just makes a lot of sense. So you tell it which sound, so you can actually set an entire sound asset over here, like, the sound that you choose that you've brought in. You give it that name. In this case, the cyberpunk theme. We set it to 2.5 is the start of the loop, and the end of the loop is at 5 seconds, which means it's going to play continuously into there. So if we change this a little bit, we'll put that at 5, put this at 15. Now, through just a couple of numbers, I've now updated my loop so that it starts at 5. The audio plays like normal, but when it reaches that loop point, it's going to jump back. This is really, really fantastic for anyone who just needs to have looping audio in specific sections. And this is something that you can change on the fly as well. It is dynamic. And really, it just allows you to not be in other audio editing software, which for me, I absolutely hate. I'm not an audio person. Like I said at the beginning, I think of audio the last thing inside of my game. And when I have to edit audio, it is a pain. But having these functions now allows me, for my games at least, to just do almost everything inside of GameMaker, which is very, very exciting. So, audio loop start, audio loop end. You set these and you're good to go. You can also set them for specific sound IDs like sound. So in theory, you could set this specific instance of the Cyberpunk theme to loop and another one to not loop, and you could play them simultaneously. There's a lot you could do there, and it could get very overwhelming depending on how much time and effort you put into something like that. But now you have the power. So that's it. We have come to the end of the audio webinar. Hopefully, this is going to allow you to level up your games, especially when it comes to the sound inside of them. I'm going to take a few more questions. If anybody has anything they want to know, put them in the chat. I'll take just a few minutes to sit here awkwardly and see if anybody has anything they want to say or read out, and then we'll call it a day or a night or a morning, depending on where you're at. All right. Sharknado asks, is there a way to know if a song has looped in code? Say you want to add in an instrument to the song after it loops or after it loops for the third time. Let's take a look. Because that is a really good question. And I don't know the answer. Looking through this, you can add multiple loops if you wanted to. And you can have them start and stop. Intros and outros for them. I don't see... Sam, if you've got anything... If you have an answer to this, let me know, because that is a really great question. I do not see a function to tell you how many times you have looped, and I don't know that there is any sort of struct or built-in property that counts how many times you've looped. That would be something that you could absolutely add in yourself, but I do not see built-in functionality for counting the amount of loops that are there. That would definitely be a suggestion to put in there. Ramus asks, if I have a 2D platformer game in a background with parallax, is the Z-axis when playing a sound a good option to use to play a sound coming from that background? Yes. You could use the Z-axis in any way you wanted to, and I could see audio coming from a background idea that would make sense, because the Z-axis is really just another plane. And in your 2D game, right, you've got up and down, left and right. And if your 2D game, your Z-axis was actually further away from the player like that, kind of like depth inside of rooms, that absolutely makes sense. Because if you set it at the maximum fallout distance and then you slowly increase it while that... For your question... I think I just put way too much inside of that. For a parallax scrolling like that, no, I don't think that would make any sense, because you'd actually want to use the X, because it's not getting closer or further from the player unless your background actually did get closer to the player. Like it was a parallax, but maybe that parallax or it was animated and it actually got closer to the player as things went. That would make sense. That in and of itself would be a great use case for Z, because in that case your X is this way, your Y is this way, and your Z is actually how close something is to the player. That would be a pretty cool use case where like in a fighting game like Smash Bros, where you hit someone and they splatter on the screen, you could play that sound effect as louder when it splashes on the screen and further away if they get like knocked into the background of something. So in a 2D game, you could absolutely use Z in that sense. I had never thought about that, and that is a really great example and a good question. So, I don't see any more questions. It looks like this is a great time to wrap it up. We hit our hour mark. I had a great time. Again, this project is completely free and available. Just go download it, tweak it. If you want to fork the GitHub repo, then go ahead and do that and just get some cool stuff out there. The audio functions and effects are going to continue to grow. I know they want to add even more as things go. So if someone wanted to continue updating this project with everything, that would be cool. But other than that, my name's Aaron Craig. I've been here, and I have really enjoyed being here doing this. Thank you so much for joining. As I always say, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.